Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to this special guest lecture. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. Today, we have the good fortune of having David DiValerio as our speaker. Dr. DiValerio completed his PhD at the University of Virginia in 2012 and is now Associate Professor of History and Religious Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is the author of The Holy Madmen of Tibet and translator of The Life of the Madman of U. The title of today's talk is Locating the Tibetan Ascetic Self and Translating the Scholar's Feast, and it will take the form of two parts. In part one, Professor DiValerio will discuss the history of long-term retreat in Tibetan literature, and in the second part, he will discuss his process for translating the epic Kagyu-centric history of the Scholar's Feast. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker.
So thanks to Joe and Dorje Gelbo for putting this together. It was very last minute. This all came together in about a week, and it's nice to see that so many people have decided to join us. Dorje, how many people do we have online? Okay, great. Hey, thanks, everybody. So yeah, as Joe mentioned, I'm going to spend the first 25 minutes or so talking about a part of a chapter from my forthcoming book. And then after that, I want to pause for Q&A so we can have some back and forth. And that way, hopefully, I can sort of present the bigger picture of the book to you all. And then after that, I'm going to sort of take over again and talk for a little bit about my process in translating the Chögyam Khepe Gatun. So my slideshow today features a number of Himalayan landscapes by Nicholas Roerich, which I find to be a fitting visual expression of my subject matter. At the very core of Himalayan ascetic culture is the practice of individual long-term meditative retreat. This is the tradition of a person's withdrawing to a place of solitude in order to meditate intensively for years, even decades at a stretch, commonly enduring extreme ascetic circumstances in the process. Individual long-term retreat has been taken up by men and women, clerical and lay, across all sectarian distinctions. This tradition of eremitism, anchoritism, reclusion, whatever we may call it, is unbroken at any point in Tibet's history. The 11th century poet Saint Milarepa is the foremost exemplar of the tradition of long-term retreat. While meditating in solitude for many years, Milarepa purportedly turned green from living exclusively off nettles. We know about the individual retreat tradition through biographies of Tibet's great ascetic meditators and also through studies that draw upon this hagiographic material. This includes my own early career research. But seeking a different perspective on this tradition, I began to collect and read texts offering instruction for the practice of retreat. The final product of this research is my forthcoming book, Mountain Dharma, Meditative Retreat and the Tibetan Ascetic Self, which is scheduled for publication in September. This is the first book-length study of individual long-term retreat in Tibetan Buddhism. Rather than focus on how any individual meditator has navigated or experienced long-term retreat, the goal of this study is to better understand the system of norms that informs how the ascetic endeavor has been understood. This study details how, rather than being an island unto themselves or a disembodied consciousness, the ascetic exists in a world of positive relationships, relations to their environment, to material things, to themselves, and to other people, both friend and foe. This research project tracks how Tibetan meditator intellectuals have problematized certain quotidian concerns in the retreat endeavor towards reconstructing how they have understood these relations. Viewing ascetic practice as a site of perpetual self-formation, this project demonstrates how, in devoting the entirety of one's being to achieving the Buddhist realization of the Buddhist truth of no self, new selves are necessarily produced along the way. Mountain Dharma also makes a significant transhistorical argument about the nature of enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism. I do this by tracking how conceptions of enlightenment have evolved over the history of the retreat tradition, as I will suggest today. Chapter 1 of Mountain Dharma gives an overview of the prescriptions for individual retreat that constitute the principal source material for this study. These 29 texts, composed between the 12th century and the early decades of the 20th, are listed chronologically in the handout I have distributed. The texts that I will mention today are in bold. My sources come from authors based in the Kagyu, Nyingma, Gelug, and Kadam traditions. I know of no other tradition of religious asceticism worldwide that has produced an archive of instructions as detailed or as extensive as this, creating an unparalleled opportunity to examine an ascetic tradition in a historical frame. As such, if presented correctly, with this project, I should be able to make a significant contribution not just to Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies, but to religious studies as a whole. Of this more than 2,200 pages of Tibetan text, less than 20 pages is available in English translation. My method in working with this material is to first make a loose sight translation of the entire text from start to finish. I then go back and identify the passages that relate to particular themes to see what patterns or significant observations emerge. Based on my reading of this material over a number of years, some of the most important concerns in the retreat endeavor are place, people, food, the body, specifically via an examination of how bodily threats are navigated, the spiritual lineage, and finally the dimension of time. Examining how these 29 texts respectively problematize these rather quotidian concerns, each chapter traces the trends, arcs, and ruptures that have defined the discourse over time. By considering these instructions as technologies of self, this study offers a genealogy of personhood in the Himalayan ascetic context. Having given this overview, I'll now demonstrate how this works by zeroing in on the contents of Chapter 2 on the topic of place. The questions we will be exploring are, how has the Tibetan ascetic tradition treated the question of place? And what might this tell us about the history of meditation in Tibet? Or to be more precise, what might this tell us about the history of the meditating subject in Tibet? A decision that a meditator must necessarily make before beginning a retreat is that of where to do it. This entails two separate issues. First, the physical structure that is to be inhabited, whether a cave, a cabin, or a hut, and second, where that structure is located. The question of the physical structure has not been subject to much elaboration historically, being addressed relatively rarely in this body of literature. By contrast, the question of where the dwelling might be located is discussed in almost every prescriptive retreat text, providing us with a rich body of thought to work with. It is the second question, that of the location, that I'll be focusing on today. First, to provide background, I'll briefly summarize some notions about place that have been held as axiomatic throughout the history of the Himalayan retreat tradition. Then I will present what I see as three distinct ways of understanding the relationship between the retreatant and the physical world they inhabit, showing how these ways of seeing and acting are productive of different kinds of selfhood. After that, I will open up to talk about the book as a whole, along with a couple of major takeaway points. Throughout the history of Eremitism in Tibetan religious culture, the tradition has been completely consistent regarding the necessity of withdrawing to an unpeopled area for the purpose of meditative retreat. This imperative is conveyed through the basic vocabulary used to refer to a proper retreat location. One key word in this respect is wen, spelled dao wadring bawena wen, meaning to be empty or devoid of something. This word appears in terms like newempa, wenne, and wensa, which are ubiquitous in retreat discourse. In most instances, the author does not mention what such a place is meant to be devoid of. However, in his retreat manual, the Richa Dutsi Ninku, or Mountain Dharma, the quintessence of nectar, the third Karmapa Rangjung Dorje writes that a location suitable for retreat is, quote, free from the ways of men, Kewo Gyunlugwen, and free from distractions, Dutsi Wempa. Another author characterizes a suitable retreat location as being, quote, devoid of human comings and goings, Mi Gyutrugiwen. When it comes to expressing the Tibetan Anchoritic tradition's emphasis on interpersonal isolation, the word wen is second in importance only to the word ri, or mountain. For background, Tibetan culture displays a strong predilection for thinking, speaking, and behaving in terms of vertical hierarchies. The spiritual or worldly ranking of individuals is marked by the heights of the seats offered to them. A person touches the photo of the Lama to their head to honor it and receive its blessing, while always being careful not to sit with their feet pointing towards the altar. Drawing insights from linguistic anthropology, we see that this derives from Tibetans living in a highly vertically differentiated landscape. Directions are offered in the form of heading up or down the valley. This carries over to affect how Tibetans speak of non-spatial things as well. In colloquial Tibetan, one refers to the upper, middle, or lower part of a day or a month. A popular two-volume Tibetan dictionary is divided into its upper and lower halves. In this specific geographic, cultural, and linguistic context, mountain acquires its meaning through the negation of what it is not, the ordinary space of human habitation down below. It is the valley floor that provides the location for agriculture, the trials and tribulations of family and village life, all the ordinary human undertakings that perpetuate samsara. Mountains, meanwhile, are the very opposite, being a natural refuge from those kinds of distractions, a place of striving to attain a higher mode of being. As such, the phrase Riche Mountain Dharma has come to serve as a term of art referring to the practice of individual long-term retreat. All but one of the texts that I will quote from today has the phrase Mountain Dharma in its title. In sum, we can observe that in Tibetan religious culture, the mountain functions in a way directly comparable to the forest of South and Southeast Asian religions or the desert of Christianity. The ubiquity of the terms when and re conveys the Tibetan Aromatic tradition's unchanging call to physically remove oneself from the world of ordinary human affairs in order to meditate without distraction. However, Tibetan texts offering prescriptions for how to do long-term retreat also offer more specific instructions regarding how to determine the suitability of a potential retreat site. What kind of mountain should one seek out, and why? I will now discuss three distinctive strains and how authors of retreat instructions have problematized space, showing that each is based on a different conception of how the ascetic relates to their surroundings. I refer to these as different modes of geospatial awareness. I argue that these distinctive ways of seeing and making sense of one's environment have played a formative role in constituting the Tibetan ascetic self historically. The first mode of geospatial awareness that I present is exemplified in one of the earliest texts considered in this study, Chegom Sherab Dorje's Retreat Keldendrome, or Lamp for Fortunate Mountain Hermits. Chegompa's understanding of how the meditator will relate to their surroundings is best conveyed in the response to the question of how a recluse can continue to have access to Dharma instruction while living in interpersonal isolation. Chegompa writes, "When one stays in a remote mountain hermitage, the vegetation and the forest change in color on account of the changing of the four seasons. The flowers, new and old, replace one another by turns. The seasons dry out the plant life, the winds scatter the fruits, and thus the dharmas of impermanence and change are taught to the solitary person. The way the streams emerge and dry up, increase and decrease, how the birds and deer migrate without certainty, the way the sun and moon and stars appear and decline, are clear or obscured, and so on. These all teach the suffering of the impermanence of compounded things. All phenomena are like dreams or illusions lacking truth. They teach the Dharma of not being attached to things that are baseless and impermanent." Drawing upon this same logic, Chegompa describes how if a meditator should become afraid being alone in the forest at nighttime, this can provide an opportunity to remember the Lama's instructions and thereby become more certain of Dharmic truths. The picture given in these passages is not of the ascetics merely inhabiting the lush and frightening world of a mountain forest, but of the ascetics relating intimately to those surroundings insofar as they continually instruct the meditator in the higher truths of Buddhism, both day and night. I call this the experiential mode of geospatial awareness. In this manner of thinking about space, potential retreat locations are treated in a generic manner. There is no indication that any particular mountainous locale might serve a meditator's needs differently from any other. This is a non-site specific way of thinking about place. This basic manner of thinking about how a meditator relates to their surroundings can be traced back to the early days of Indian Buddhism. Buddhaghosa's 5th century Pali classic, the Visuddhimagga, or Path of Purification, lists 13 dhutangas, or ascetic practices, for Buddhist monastics. One of these observances is to dwell at the foot of a tree. Remaining there, Buddhaghosa writes, the meditator cannot help but observe changes in the tree's foliage as caused by the progression of the seasons, which serves as a lesson in impermanence. I will now present two other ways that the Tibetan ascetic tradition has problematized space, both of which are more prominent in the discourse than this first one. These latter two ways of making the landscape legible to the potential hermit are site-specific, maintaining that the meditating subject is affected, positively or negatively, by specific aspects of their physical surroundings. But the question of on what grounds the meditator is affected by their environment has been answered in two very different ways, a distinction of great consequence in the history of the Tibetan ascetic self. The second mode of geospatial awareness is best exemplified in Yangompa Gyaltsen Pel's Richer Yonten Kunjungwa Rinpoche Barwatang Lentub, or Blazing Jewel, the mountain Dharma that is the source of all good qualities, along with its appendix. This is the most influential retreat manual of the pre-modern period. Yangompa's discussion of place is confined to a very dense two-folio side chapter given at the beginning of the Blazing Jewel. This is revisited in 6 folio sides of commentary in the Lentub, or appendix. Yangompa's treatment of potential retreat locations comprises a litany of characteristics that a location might have, and how those characteristics are conducive to certain positive or negative outcomes for a meditator. A rocky mountain, for example, is dominated by a feeling of sadness and is conducive to the practices of tumo, an illusory body. Slate or snow mountains are dominated by clarity and support meditation on the dependently arisen nature of phenomena and the practice of luminosity. If the site is on a mountain that resembles a person sitting upright with legs crossed, this will encourage establishing oneself in samadhi. If the mountain resembles a lotus in bloom, this will support attaining realization. It is auspicious if the mountain behind the meditator is a high one. But if there is a high mountain to the east, this will consume the meditator's life force, and so on. The appendix's commentary in this chapter further increases the range of considerations for evaluating a potential retreat site, extending into the macro and micro dimensions simultaneously. In addition to the factors listed in the root text, the meditator is instructed to take into account the relative levels of economic development of different regions of Asia. They must also be sensitive to the features of the room they will inhabit, in what direction the door lies, the orientation of the room's pillars and beams. The meditator must also become attuned to the clothing that they wear. Their hat constitutes a tendril or dependent connection with the Lama. The hem of the robe is connected to the question of material resources, and so on. On the topic of where to do retreat and why, Yangompa has presented a dizzying array of considerations to be taken into account simultaneously. Moving outwards concentrically, the meditator should be attentive to the clothing that enwraps their body, the structure of the room they inhabit, the form of the mountainside on which they sit, the contours of the topography they look out on, even what region of the earth they would reside in. What all of these factors have in common is their existing in physical relationship to the meditator, either more or less proximately at a given moment. This is a mode of geospatial awareness that we can refer to as geomantic or perhaps topomantic, as it entails divining the presence of mystical, unseen forces deriving from the landscape based on a received body of lore. While the experiential mode of geospatial awareness is predicated upon the ascetic's cognitive awareness of what takes place in their surroundings, the geomantic does not require this. These features of the physical world naturally, automatically affect the meditator in these ways. This view suggests an extremely porous, unbuffered selfhood for the ascetic. The geomantic mode of geospatial awareness would dominate Himalayan Eremitic practice for centuries. Yangompa's 13th century treatment of geomancy would be cited and referred to by a handful of later authors, making it one of the most influential passages in the entire corpus of retreat literature. There would be other schools of geomantic thinking as well. However, in the latter centuries of the tradition, a new way of understanding the relationship between the meditator and their surroundings became most prominent, suggesting a deep change in thinking about the nature of the ascetic self. I refer to this as the reverential mode of geospatial awareness. In his 17th century Richer Tsamgi Sheldam, or Mountain Dharma, Direct Advice on Retreat, second in importance only to Yangompa's text, Karma Chakme explains that there are certain places that were long ago blessed by the heroes and the Dakinis. were later visited by the Indian saint Padmasambhava, and whose significance was at some subsequent moment re-identified, Ngösung, by Tibetan Mahasiddhas. There are hundreds of such places that are regarded as major sites, as well as thousands of lesser ones. Karma Chakme asserts that meditating at one of these sites for a single day is superior to meditating for an entire year in a place that is not so empowered. If one cannot meditate in such a place, there are other sites where past masters of the Kagyu lineage have meditated or at least visited. Presenting this view as entirely normative, Karma Chakme states that the need to do a retreat in such a place with such a connection to the past, quote, has been taught in every meditation instruction. A few decades before this, Lotsun Namkha Jigme wrote in his Garland of Critical Points for the Precious Mountain Dharma that in order to be a proper site for retreat, a location, quote, should have been blessed by the presence of siddhas in the past and be a place indicated in prophecies. Zormang Lekshe Dryang takes this way of thinking about place a step further. In his list of the kinds of locations that are unsuitable for retreat, he mentions haunted places, places frequented by bandits and predatory beasts, and also, quote, places where the siddhas of the past did not set their feet. Based on the way this is formulated, it seems the discourse has gone past a tipping point, now taking the reverential mode of geospatial awareness somewhat for granted. Finally, in the early 20th century, Karma Ngedon Tenge would affirm this mode of geospatial awareness without ambiguity. He writes that when evaluating the suitability of a potential retreat site, quote, the most important distinguishing feature is that it be a mountain abode blessed by the siddhas of the past. These and other examples show how in the latter centuries of the Tibetan Eremitic tradition, a new value came to be most prominent in the calculations for determining the suitability of a potential retreat site, whether or not a specific place had been occupied by some highly accomplished master in the past. This is a way of conceiving of the meditator's relationship to space that is site-specific, but is so on a basis completely different from that of the geomantic mode. In the reverential mode of geospatial awareness, the primary locus of elaboration for a place is not its physical details in the present moment, but rather the question of what may have occurred there in the past. In this view, individual meditation sites are less like places whose details are to be mapped and more like vessels conveying imprints that were created in the past. In the reverential mode of geospatial awareness, the topography comes legible through the adoption of a perspective that is fundamentally historical. This way of thinking about the yogin's relationship to the physical world entails a flattening of space and of the individual in the present moment in favor of an elaboration of space and the individual in a historical frame. In a few moments, I'll return to say more about the implications of the reverential mode of geospatial awareness and how it relates to the central argument of my book. For now, I would like to close my discussion of these three modes by clarifying that there is no neat historical transition from one manner of problematizing place to the next. It is not uncommon for later authors to make explicit reference to more than one of these modes in a given text. It can then become very telling to determine how the author hierarchizes those modes vis-a-vis one another, providing a useful means of tracking trends within the discourse. Nor do these three modes represent the full range of thinking about place in the Tibetan retreat tradition, as I show in my longer chapter on this topic. But to summarize what I have shown, we see that these three modes of geospatial awareness are different ways of making the landscape legible to the meditator, and they are based on different understandings of the fundamental relationship between the meditator and their surroundings. As such, they are different ways of thinking about the selfhood of the ascetic, for they propose that different entire categories of seen or unseen forces might be at play in determining what the meditator experiences during their time in retreat. In retrospect, we see that the dimension of space has been a blank canvas onto which Tibetan meditator intellectuals have projected highly contrasting notions of selfhood. To give a taste of what the other parts of Mountain Dharma are about, Chapter 3 focuses on the instructions that authors have given for maintaining the interpersonal isolation that defines the retreat endeavor. We see that from the 12th century to the 20th, there's a profound reimagining of what isolation means as we move from an ideal of pure solitude expressed by Yangompa towards one that allows for interaction with the laity and with other retreatants, the boundary of the retreat becoming more porous over time. In this way, each chapter tells its own story concerning the evolving discourse about food, about the body, about the lineage, which taken together traces a comprehensive genealogy of the Tibetan ascetic self. I will now step back to convey two of the bigger points that I make in the course of the book. These 2 points are deeply interrelated. Point number 1. The reverential mode of geospatial awareness is based on the idea that earlier masters possessed sufficient greatness to open new sites for meditative practice, leaving so powerful a presence that it could affect a person's meditative outcomes hundreds of years later. By needing to rely on a place that has been so empowered, the retreatant is reminded of their own lack of spiritual potency. The reverential mode of geospatial awareness thereby establishes a gap in time and in sanctity between, on the one hand, the latter-day anchorite, and on the other, the enlightened forebears of the tradition. The very moment the ascetic chooses a location for the retreat based on this specific mode of geospatial awareness, their lesser status vis-a-vis the earlier and more enlightened members of their tradition is made manifest. This dynamic exemplifies an attitude that I argue has driven the evolution of ascetic practice in Tibet. I refer to this as lived deferential reverence. This means that the form of asceticism that a practitioner lives by becomes an expression of a deferential relationship to that which the tradition most reveres. In Mountain Dharma, I show that this basic orientation affects developments in many different aspects of ascetic comportment over time. In Chapter 3, I quote Latter-day authors who assert that although the masters of earlier generations were able to remain in perfect interpersonal isolation, our diminished capabilities mean that now we need to do our retreats alongside or even with other meditators. We're simply no longer capable of enacting the most ideal form of the practice. In Chapter 4, we see that Latter-day Retreat manuals provide extensive instructions for leaving one's cave in order to go begging for food. These instructions are offered in contrast to the ways of the enlightened forebears of the tradition, like Milarepa, who are said to have transcended the need for human food absolutely. Summing up this view, as Ngawang Tenzin Norbu writes near the beginning of his 1914 text, The Charter, Direct Advice on the Mountain Dharma, quote, "As for renouncing all the wonderful things of this life and practicing the Dharma, it is difficult for us Dharma pretenders of the degenerate age to equal any part of the external or internal conduct of the superior ones who came before." The instructions that he gives in the remainder of the text are offered in light of this characterization. With this attitude of lived deferential reverence emerging with respect to diverse facets of the retreat endeavor, I argue that it has played a central, driving role in the history of Eremitic practice in the Himalaya. This dynamic serves to enshrine the meditative accomplishments of the founders of the lineage while explaining why such accomplishment is no longer to be observed in the world in which we live. Put differently, the sacredness that the ascetic practitioner strives for recedes from the horizon of possibility as the discourse reaffirms enlightenment's place as the very source of the tradition. And now to the second point, which is interrelated with the first. One thing that is entailed by this attitude of lived deferential reference is that it defines the meditator as a being in time. For example, we can see that neither the experiential nor the geomantic mode of geospatial awareness fosters any kind of historical awareness on behalf of the practitioner. These modes are concerned only with circumstances in the present moment. But in making the landscape legible through the question of what some great master may have done in a place long ago, the reverential mode of geospatial awareness defines the meditator as a historical being, existing at a particular moment in time, at a remove from those earlier masters. Throughout Mountain Dharma, I show that when explicitly connected to expressions of lived deferential reverence, prescriptions relating to ascetic comportment become technologies of a self that is defined as a being in time. By the 17th century, leaving one's cave in order to go begging for food has become an expression of one's place in history. Chapter 7 of Mountain Dharma focuses specifically on how the retreatant has been defined in relationship to time. Among Tibetan Buddhist communities anywhere in the world today, if you make reference to long-term retreat, most people will immediately think of a retreat lasting specifically for a period of 3 years and 3 months, 3 years and 3 fortnights, 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, or some variation thereof. This is expressed in Tibetan as losum choksum. The latter part, 3 chok, spelled payata chanro chokasa chok, has been understood in different ways, giving rise to this diversity. The ideal of practicing meditation specifically for such a period of time derives from the Kala Chakra and other late tantras, which view individuals as connected to the world around them through a series of micro-macro cosmic relationships. These texts stipulate that 1/32nd part of each breath provides the space for spiritual transformation, which is articulated as the transformation of the ordinary psychophysical winds into the, quote, wind of wisdom. These texts also assert that we live in a world age in which the standard human lifespan is 100 years. 100 years divided by 32 gives you 3 years and 3 fortnights, which is therefore the minimum amount of time that it takes to achieve enlightenment in this system. In Chapter 7 of Mountain Dharma, I show that in spite of both its origins in authoritative scriptures and the ubiquity of this category within Tibetan Buddhism today, throughout most of the history of individual retreat, this ideal had far less of an impact than one would expect. The ideal of losum choksum is not mentioned in any of the texts that I look at prior to Karma Chakme's late 17th century manual. The ubiquity of the ideal of the 3 or 3-month retreat today can be traced back to the career of the great polysectarian polymath Jomgon Kongtrul, who established a retreat program lasting specifically for this length of time. Jomgon Kongtrul's retreat center in eastern Tibet was called Sadra. In the closing chapter of Mountain Dharma, I argue that the rise to prominence of the communal 3-year, 3-month retreat is the culmination of a long arc of development in the history of the Tibetan ascetic self, driven by the attitude of lived deferential reverence. A communal retreat taking place at an established holy site, with half a dozen or so men or women living together in a cloister, completely cut off from the world outside, safe from bodily threats, their meals prepared by a designated cook. This model resolves many of the challenges inherent to individual long-term retreat. With the rise to prominence of this new model, we can see how a specific notion of time now directly impinges upon the definition of the personhood of the individual, upon their meditative practice, and even on the very idea of enlightenment. Thank you. So let's take some time now and do Q&A before I move on to the next part. Yes. Yeah.
That's a very interesting trend that you've traced out there, and I'm wondering if it might also, the trend might be both caused by and contributing to this shift from, well, and anyway, once these places that people do retreat in that have all these qualities get so well known that so many people come to stay there that they obliterate the original qualities that made them desirable to stay in. And so this development of the, what are you calling it?
The reverential
is a reaction to that and encourages it and is kind of an apology for the fact that this is no longer available as it was before. You see what I'm driving at?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to what was happening on the ground and why they might have started to speak about individual places in a different way. But one thing I do argue in the chapter, and I think is maybe somewhat related to what you're talking about, is I talk about this as part of this broader process of sort of taming and making sense of the Tibetan landscape, which scholars have been talking about since the 90s, right? Reading pilgrimage guides and so on to talk about, to examine how they talk about place towards sort of mapping and making sense of the Tibetan landscape, which goes back to, the taming of the demonists way back in the 8th century or whatever, right? This long process that continues all the way into today. I believe that the rise of this reverential mode of geospatial awareness shows that individual retreats sort of became part of that broader collective process that the entire Tibetan world was, participating in, and which continues into the present. So it's a different twist on the sort of dynamic that you're suggesting, but I certainly think that we could be thinking in similar terms.
I think that's true, and I think that your insight that Jamin Kongtrul, was it? Yeah, did with this 3-year retreat is actually a brilliant compromise that he came up with to try and get through these contradictions, as it were.
And the sort of history of that communal model of retreat is sort of unclear where exactly it started and when. I haven't sorted all that out. That's a whole separate project. He's not the first person to formulate this, and it's really only because of Kalu Rinpoche going all over the world and establishing dozens and dozens of retreat centers that it has become as prominent as it is today. That's all kind of a funny quirk of history. I mean, because Kongtrul didn't do any of this with that kind of plan in mind. He's just created a retreat center. The Chayik, the text that he wrote, sort of providing the outline for how to do retreat in that place, is just for that place. And the fact that it's been taken and adapted and spread all over the world is fascinating to me. But that shows, I think, that we're at a certain moment in time where that model of retreat suddenly made great sense to people. And it continues to make great sense to people because it continues to grow. And these 3-year retreat centers are only expanding as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I know it's only a small portion of the research that you've done. You have one chapter, number 3, that is about people. I'm wondering also, I know that in at least some of the texts, an important role or an importance is given to the relationship of the people in the retreat with the beings, the invisible beings that are there, the Shadak, Shibdak, and so on and so forth. You're not making it a chapter in itself. Maybe you could tell us something in the broad strokes that you observed of how meditators are supposed to relate to them, and also what you think in modern days. I mean, the readers of your book, they probably haven't seen any ghosts or demons. I'm assuming so. Is for you those are those descriptions something particularly relevant for the Tibetans because they were able to relate to those beings, or how do you read those passages in view of the modern meditator?
So I think if I were to expand this book by one more chapter, the obvious thing that's missing is spirit beings. I think that's one piece of the puzzle that I haven't really represented here. It comes up kind of throughout the book in certain places, so it's not absent from the book, but I'm not sort of taking it head on as one could. So that's a very astute question that you're asking. The most important spirit beings that are referred to throughout all this retreat literature is the Shidak, who are sort of seen as helping to provide material resources. Or if you're failing to get the material resources, it's because the Shidak are displeased. So often, a lot of the retreat manuals talk about at the beginning of the retreat, you make a declaration to the local spirit saying, I'm going to stay here for this amount of time. You know, I'm going to be true to my vows and my commitments, and I'm asking you to please provide materially for me while I'm here, and so on. That's one way that it comes up. In the chapter on the body, I talk about sort of dealing with threats. There I talk about prescriptions that are given for if your cave gets sort of, if you're being invaded by a dangerous animal or by demons, and the sort of ways that you can respond in that moment and so on. So there are numerous examples from throughout the whole history of the tradition. Yes, one could write probably a whole book specifically about that. It comes up at various places in the book. I don't really take it head on. The second part of your question about like, what about a modern practitioner who hasn't ever seen a demon before? I don't know. I don't know how people personally sort of adjudicate those discrepancies or how they interpret the tradition in light of that. That's I don't know. I mean, this is text-based, right? This study ends the beginning of the 20th century. This is not connected to my current research, which is about going to retreat centers and talking to people now. Totally separate project, although clearly it's the next step. So yes, one could go back through and reread all this literature and really dig into this question of the various spirit beings and how they factor in. There's plenty of room for that. It's not a central thing in this book, but it comes out throughout the book. Yeah.
I'm wondering how does gender figure in the making of the Tibetan Ascetic Self, like looking at the outline, like for example, I'm looking at food, like food making is traditionally more of a feminine labor. So if you can elaborate on that.
So excellent question. So you have a list of the retreat manuals that are the central source material for this project. Every single one of them was written by a man, and every single one of them was written for a presumed male audience. They don't say this isn't for women, but it's written for men. You can tell. They have these instructions that say, well, if a woman comes into your retreat, this is what you do. They don't say, well, if a man comes into your retreat, this is what you do. It's written for a presumed male readership. I have not found a single prescriptive retreat text of this sort specifically for women, nor have I ever found one written by women. I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm just saying I haven't found them. There was that giant collection of instructions for and by Tibetan Buddhist women coming out of Serta that was published a few years ago. I looked through that. I didn't find anything that sort of rose to that level. There's certainly things that are similar to the kinds of texts I'm working with here, but they don't quite fit into this. So women are sort of absent from the story that I tell in this book. They were participating in retreat throughout the entire history of it, and yet they're sort of written out of the sources that we have. To do a different study that sort of focused on their involvement would require work with different kinds of sources. One good place to look at would be like Jakarta, which has been a hub for nuns practicing meditation in a communal setting for centuries. So there are places and sort of ways we could get at women's participation in the tradition, but it doesn't come out in the literature that I'm focusing on for this project. That's a great PhD project for someone else to take on. There's tons of other ways to approach this topic, right? The door is open to more and more studies that expand in this area. That would be a great one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's no mentioning of gender in like your chapter on food?
No. No. This is for. So I'll just briefly talk about the chapter on food. That chapter, again, like the other chapters, it tracks changes in how food gets problematized over time. I begin with Yangompa, who talks about food as this sort of obstacle, and you eat it and it affects you negatively. And he really sees food in like a very bad way. He sort of has this real suspicion about food, but he doesn't say anything about how you get food. Right? That's completely missing from Yangompa's treatment of it. Then for the sort of middle centuries of the tradition, the concern is how do you get food without losing your legitimacy as an ascetic? So there's all these rules for how to go begging. When you go begging, do this and this and this, don't do this and this. So it becomes sort of normal, it becomes expected that you're going to have to leave your retreat to go out and get food. By the last couple centuries of the tradition, the main way they're talking about food is as kor, dao kana no kora kor, which is about your monastic status and making sure. Hello, welcome. Making sure that at the moment that you consume the food, you are a legitimate monk, which shows the sort of intrusion of monastic ideals into the ascetic tradition. That's another thing that this book tracks across different chapters. There's almost nothing said about, in the whole history of all this, preparing the food or the substance of the food. Those are not really concerns. It's more about how you get it and how that relates to your ascetic bearing and so on. Yeah. Sorry, he had his hand up. He was looking for the mic, weren't you? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Kempo Sange. My friend just invited me for this lecture, and I found one thing is that the 3 years and three choksum.
Yeah.
So, what you describe the choksum?
Yeah.
Do you have any research in this 3 years? 3 directions.
So people have different understandings of what chok means here. I think if we go back to the Kala Chakra Tantra and other tantras, this doesn't just come from Kala Chakra, it's from this whole, it shows up in the Chakra Samvara and other tantras as well. In that context, chok translates the Sanskrit vaksh, which is connected to the English word wax, as in waxing moon. So it specifically means a fortnight, half of a month. That's really exactly, that's the technical meaning of what chok means, going back. Now, over hundreds of years, all other meanings have sort of come into it. And now most people say losum dasum, right? 3 years and 3 months instead of 3 fortnights. The point is that this is a minimum. Most retreats are longer than this because they usually begin and end on like auspicious days or something. Also, this gets mixed up because we use different calendars. These calculations are based on the Kala Chakra lunar calendar, which is 360 days in the year. We mostly use a solar calendar now of 365, right? So there's sort of slippage and it becomes kind of inexact over time. But the original meaning of chok is a direct translation of the Sanskrit vaksh, which means half of a lunar month.
Yes, you found the meaning of chok.
Yeah.
But exactly the 3 years, and 1 month and a half days.
Yeah.
It means that in our physical, there is tsalung tigle.
Yeah.
3 kind of tsalung tigle.
Yes.
And when we practice the all preliminary, and exactly practice of the tsalung tigle, if we really do our practice very well, then our ta'uma will dissolve in 3 years, 1.5 months.
Right.
During this exact time, we can get the Buddhahood or Vajra Torjishang.
Right.
So that's the exact Losum Choksum, what means is that. So, and you also say that Jamul Lord Thai was the first.
No, definitely not the first. Yeah.
But the person in Tibet tradition, he built the first Losum Choksum tradition. That's true.
No. It goes back to the Jonangpas. In the Blue Annals, which was written in the 15th century, it talks about Jonangpas doing Losum Choksum centuries earlier, and even in the 15th century. So it goes back. The history of it is unclear. We don't really know. That's a different research project that I think someone should look more into. But there's sort of traces and hints going all the way back. And I think for the Jonang, it was always there.
Yeah, but what I read the history, I haven't do any research, but in history that the traditional 3 years, 1.5 months traditional retreat was established by Jamul Lord Thai. Before that, there is a retreat like this, but the traditional now what's the traditional going in the 4 of school of Tibetan Buddhism, it was established by Jamul Lord Thai.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, he critiques. So, I mean, part of it is in his writings, he critiques other Drupkongs that are doing Losum Choksum in his writings, meaning that other people were doing it before him. It's unclear. It's hazy. It's a different project that looks that there's more going into.
From my point, it's very clear. The Losum Choksum was in the Tantra.
Yeah.
Kala Chakra Tantra.
No
There's
question
no any
about
doubt.
that.
So also Jonah is the same thing. But what the way tradition is established by Jamul Lord Thai.
Great.
I think it's
Thank
clear.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So maybe one more question, and then I'll move to the next part of my. Maybe I need to reserve. Joe, what time do we go until? 4:30. Okay, so I'll reserve 20 minutes to talk about my translation, meaning we still have 20 minutes more of this. So sure, let's keep going. Yeah. We had one more question in the room, and then we can go to the online, right? Yeah.
The fact that there are 3 years and 3 fortnights, does it also entail that there is a specific curriculum for the retreat?
Yes and no. Every retreat center has their own curriculum that they follow, and they change and evolve over time. So this is part of my new project as I'm visiting retreat centers all over the world. I'm saying, well, what is your curriculum and how has it changed over the years? Almost every retreat center that I've been to, especially the ones in the West, is every subsequent retreat that they do less. They started off trying to do Jamgon Kongtrul's whole curriculum, and most Westerners say this is too much. We don't know. We didn't grow up in this tradition. It takes us longer to learn it. So they do less and less, and it gets pared down and simplified over time. And then there's variations on it and so on. So it's an active living thing which shows the sort of importance of this category in shaping people's expectations about meditation while this evolution continues.
And is that also related with the systematization of the Ngonjo with the 4 outer preliminaries and 5 or 4?
I don't know. That's a separate question, right? The history of the Ngonjo and how that got systematized over time. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
could be related. Yeah. I mean, so connected to this idea that it should be 3 years and 3 fortnights, a lot of retreat centers expect that the meditator will sleep sitting up. That's normal a lot of places. Not every place adheres to it, but it's normal. I was talking to the Drupana Pulahari like last week about this, and he says, well, he's not super strict about it. There's nowhere to lay down. So you can't lay down. You're kind of on your box. But he's like, if they slump or whatever, he's okay with that. He says like between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. when he goes to check on them, it's kind of their time. And how strict they want to be with being upright is kind of up to them. But 4 a.m., they got to be on the cushion for the first tune of the day. So it's interesting, right? As this living thing that people are constantly negotiating these boundaries, it never ends. So, Georgia, can we take questions from online?
So, what about practitioners who, rather than going on retreat to places lacking disturbances, instead go to disturbing and frightening places to test and enhance the stability of their meditation practice? Where does this fit into the tradition?
Right. So in my chapter where I'm looking at the different ways that different authors talk about where you should do your retreat and so on, there's sort of variation. Some of them say, well, for beginning practitioners, you want to go somewhere safe. But if you're at a more advanced level, then you specifically want to go somewhere that's inhabited by demons and that is scary and so on. So some authors do specifically say that, and they often tie it to the question of where in a practitioner's progression they are. So this is something that different authors have treated and spoken differently about throughout the history of the tradition. So this question is exactly right on. Yeah. Okay.
I just have a very short question.
Yeah.
Your work is about retreat, like specifically long-term retreat and ascetic practices. You also have done a retreat yourself? No. So it's mostly just from texts.
This project, as you're seeing here, is entirely based on texts. These are the core texts that I'm working with. There's 29 of them listed here. Those are my central source material. I also use hagiography and other sorts of things to sort of contextualize stuff. But this project is based on this stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And the project I'm doing now, where I'm going to retreat centers, is completely separate from this. Okay. If that's it, yeah, Julia, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
Recently, when I talked to a Drupan here in Nepal, I learned that for a number of retreats, it is common to have exams at the end, written exams, and because for them the aim seemed to be to produce people that can correctly carry out rituals that the village people then need. So I was wondering if there is a source, a literary source for this kind of behavior, because I haven't heard about it before, and certainly not in the West, but might just be my ignorance. So can you say something about that?
So at one of the retreat centers I visited in the last week while I'm here, the Drupan has instituted tests. So I've heard of that at precisely one place. So I want to hear from you where you heard about this, but that's interesting to me because that shows another step in the evolution of the meaning of the retreat. So,
the retreatants also get a certificate afterwards.
Okay.
If they
Yeah.
passed.
And sometimes they have a photo taken at Benchen, at their Benchen Retreat Center in Parping. There's a photo outside of the Drupkong of every class as they come out. And sometimes they have the big hair, it varies. So that's interesting to me too. But if we look at the sort of meaning of the 3-year retreat, if we sort of focus on what it meant for Kongtrul, he's really turning the practitioner into a vessel of the tradition. It's about receiving the empowerments, receiving these teachings, doing the Nyen Drup or whatever it is that you have to sort of achieve to be a sort of qualified practitioner of that thing. including the lineages that were on the verge of being lost, like the Shangpa that he wanted to save, so that they could then be passed on. So he's conceiving of the meditator and defining the meditator as this kind of becoming a vessel, to become a sort of living vessel of the tradition, which then they can pass on. Part of how he does that is but defining the meditator as a beginner. The fact that the Ngundro is now codified as the beginning of the retreat, that clears up an ambiguity throughout the whole history of the tradition. A lot of these texts say, maybe you spend the first month doing Ngundro. You've already done Ngundro, then you're just kind of doing it again at the beginning of your retreat. Kongtrul says you're going to do full Ngundro at the beginning of the retreat. He's defining the meditator as a beginner, or at least a sort of beginning-ish kind of practitioner and so on. And I think I think for him, it sort of transformed the meditator into a vessel for the tradition so that they could pass it on. As this is being spread to France and the United States and Portugal and so on, we're seeing like another step, a sort of further evolution in this retreat as a way to sort of perpetuate the tradition. I think there's interesting stuff there.
I understood Jamgon Kongtrul's project also as a way to preserve the traditions against the Gelug influence. Is that a correct understanding?
Sure. I mean, the whole Rime tradition, right? It's largely about sort of institutional power and sort of resistance to it, and sort of trying to save things that were under threat of being lost. That's certainly part of it. It's interesting to me that not a single retreat program in the world that I'm aware of does Kongtrul's full multi-sectarian thing. It's almost always just Kagyu or Nyingma. I know of one place that does Kagyu plus 1 year of Kala Chakra. So there's one place that sort of has this multi-sectarian program, but that's very rare. It's just sort of died out. So for Kongtrul, it had this specific meaning. And then as circumstances change, the meaning of the retreat changes, and therefore the curriculum changes too. It's constantly changing all around us. It's fascinating. Okay, I'd like to move on to talking about the other project I want to sort of present today, which is my translation of the Chögyung Kepe Gatun. I translate this as The Scholar's Feast, A History of the Dharma. Other people have referred to the title as A Banquet for the Wise, and there's other ways of translating it. This is by the second of the Pawos, Tsuklak Trengwa from the 16th century. This is a Kagyu-centric history of the Dharma in India, Tibet, and elsewhere. About a third of it is taken up with the lives of the first 8 Karmapas. There's like 80-page, biographies of the 7th and 8th Karmapas, so they're actually incredibly detailed and useful. In traditional printings, it was about 1,500 folio sides. My translation will be 675,000 words or so, which is 10% longer than the Old Testament. So as of this morning, I'm 34% of the way through. I began working on this in September of 2023. It should take me about 2 more years to finish a sort of rough draft of the entire thing. This will be followed by many, many years of further research, cleaning up, and working on it. So this will be a 10-year project, 15-year project. I'm not sure. I'm at a point in my career where I can take on things like this and just work on it as I see fit. So the primary version of the text, the sort of principal version that I'm working from, is a 2006 printing from China. This is what a single page looks like. There are 780 pages. And I'd like to sort of open up a little bit about my translation process, right? What does it look like to translate something on this scale? How am I actually going about this? I know we have some translators in this room. We have some future translators. So I thought it might be useful to people to open up a little bit about my process. As I've been working on this for the past year and a half, the way I would describe my process is, quote, translating the entirety of the Scholar's Feast all at once. What do I mean by that? That seems like oxymoronic, right? How could you translate something of this scale all at once? So let me sort of show you the parts of what I mean by this. First is that essential to how I do my translation is having a fully searchable e-text of the entire text. This is absolutely essential. When I translated The Life of the Madman of U more than 10 years ago, I had no choice but to sit down and simply type in the entirety of the text, which maybe took me a couple of weeks, no big deal. Now we have other ways of getting e-texts and searchable versions of things. Now, I started this back in September of 2023, where OCR tools are, being rolled out, but they're not great yet. They're not completely reliable. So the way I got a searchable version of this text was that Karmalekshe Ling Monastery over in Kimdol has some kind of printing program. I don't know exactly what it is. They made an edition of the Chögyung Kepe Gatun, including a Word file that I was able to download. They put this for free on the internet. It's very nice of them. So I have this 1,000-page text of this, which I then cut and pasted chunk by chunk into the Tibetan and Himalayan Library's Unicode Tibetan to Wiley converter. So I was like sitting on my couch watching The Big Lebowski, doing this chunk by chunk by chunk, until I had this 670 something pages of fully searchable Wiley version of the text. So this shows where we were at in 2023 when I started this. Now, when you take on a project like this, there are much better ways to get a searchable version of the text. There are better OCR tools. They're good. They're getting better. Even in the new interface for the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, which is where I get almost all of my texts, for certain texts, you can download a searchable e-text right there. Right when you get the PDF, you can say, give me an e-text of this as well. I don't know how good it is. However good it is, it's only getting better. So year after year after year, these OCR tools generating searchable versions of things are getting better. This will change how we do all Tibetological research. Right? This is the moment right now where all of this is about to change as these tools become fully apparent. Once you can just fully search everything in the BDRC, it's going to change how we do our work. So this is kind of, let's think of this moment in time right before everything changed. So when I sit down to translate, I try and do 1 page per day. It takes me between 2.5 and 3 hours, depending on how hard it is that day. I sit down with the paper copy, which I have right here. It's the thing I carry around with me all the time. And I note any differences between that paper version and the electronic version I have. Sometimes it's typos, sometimes it's a particle that's different, sometimes it's just a misspelling or a word is missing from one version of the other. And then I work from that version, which is sort of collating the two versions. At some point later on, I will have to go back and look at older printings and block prints and go back and clear that up. I'll do that, probably 5 years from now or something like this. So why is having an e-text important for translating something like this? So I have my dictionaries, which I use, various ones that I have open on my computer all the time and I'm referring to, and I think strategically about which dictionary is likely to have what term. Sometimes I know this will be in Goldstein, but it's not going to be in any other dictionary, right? Over time, you sort of have a sense of which dictionaries are going to be useful for what terms just based on context. I use this e-text about as much as I use any dictionary, and I'm constantly looking within the contents of the text. So say I come across something and I say, what is this? By doing Control F and typing in that string, I can see, oh, this is the name of a place, and it seems to be in Kham. Great. It shows up 15 times in the text. Therefore, the mystery is solved. Or I have a person's name, a long name. Is this one person or two people? Well, if I just do a search within the text for the first part and the second half, if I see they always come together, I can determine, oh, this is one person with a long name rather than multiple people. I can also use this for grammatical constructions. Pawo Tsuklak Trengwa has an interesting, quirky way of using the construction matok, gaotanrotoka satok, right? It's kind of a tricky construction. We all know how to use it in colloquial Tibetan, but in literary Tibetan, it's kind of a complicated construction with its own sort of complex history. He uses it in a very distinctive way that I've not figured out yet. But when I come across it, I can sort of type in matok and see, for example, the 25 places in the entirety of the text where he uses it. And by looking at multiple examples, I can sort of make a better, more educated guess of how he uses this term. In this sense, in a weird way, the longer the text is, the easier it is to translate, because the more likely it is that whatever construction it is will show up multiple times. So I have this whole body of data. This is the most useful way of understanding any moment in the text, is having access to the entirety of the text. So the longer it is, maybe the easier it is. And it's also about the sort of shades of meaning that a particular author applies to a term. We don't all use the same words in the same ways. Having this giant body of literature, I can sort of see exactly how Pawo Tsuklak Trengwa uses one term or another. Another key principle to how I'm doing this is just keep going. If you get stuck, spend 5 minutes on it and just keep going. Because the fact is, the answer is probably on the next page, right? Maybe this term comes up again, but spelled a little differently. And now I can find it in the dictionary and I can go back and figure out the previous one. Or maybe it says something strange and I say, that doesn't really make any sense. On the next page, I see the same miracle described again using slightly terms. And I say, oh, that really is what it's saying. Just keep going. You have to sort of trust that within this body of text, things will be repeated. The answer will potentially reveal itself. Now, I want to get to the other part of this, translating the entirety of the Scholar's Feast all at once. So as I am doing my sort of rough translation, I sort of make my translation. And at the end of every sort of meaningful chunk, a sentence, a couple sentences, a paragraph, whatever, I type in the Wylie of the Tibetan and I note any differences between the versions. I make notes to myself. I'm not sure about this, or I found this in this dictionary spelled a slightly different way, whatever. That's notes to myself for in the future. This means that as of now, I don't need to think too hard about how I translate any given thing. If you think about all the words that mean something like honor or respect, Nyenkor, Korti, Gupa, Shabtok, and so on, right? He has probably 8 different words that Pawo Tsuklak Trengwa uses that could be translated as honor, venerate, respect, serve, revere, or whatever. They're all basically synonymous. I don't need to think too much about that now. I should just translate the sentence, note the possibilities, and later on, once I've reached the end and have sort of cleaned up the entire thing, then because I have the Wylie right there, I can type in Nyenkor, for example, and see the 35 places where it shows up. And then I could put in Korti and see the 40 places where it shows up and make a determination. This one makes more sense as honor. This one makes more sense as revere, and sort of make a sort of controlled vocabulary based on my existing translation. So this is sort of adding layers and steps to it, but it just means that I will sort of, rectify these things further on down the line. For example, now, do I translate Tekpa Chenpo as great vehicle or Mahayana? That's a really important decision. I don't want to make it right now. Let's make that decision at the end when I'm sort of thinking of the book as a whole and sort of how it's going to be presented to people. So there's a lot of decisions that I'm sort of kicking the can down the road, and I will make them later on. So this is my idea, translating the entirety of the Scholar's Feast all at once. Once I reach the end, this will require years of further research. And that's really the X factor. I know how long it will take me to get to the end of this first draft. I can guess how long it will take me to sort of clean up the translation in the end. The question is that middle period of additional research, all the Googling to try and figure out, is this the name of a text or the name of a practice? What's this story from the life of the fourth Karmapa or whatever, and so on. When I'm doing this, I'm actually drawing on the collective wisdom of our entire field. Almost, very often when I, put something in because I can't figure out what it is, it takes me to a footnote in an article somewhere by one of our colleagues, and that person has probably spent more time on the life of so-and-so, and I can say, oh, this is the name of the village where so-and-so was born. That helps. Sometimes I even come across scholarship that's based on the Scholar's Feast, and sometimes the person is actually talking about the exact passage that I'm stuck on. I had a passage that I was totally stuck on from the life of the 7th Karmapa, and Matthew Kapstein had already translated it. Great, right? So I can use that and so on. There's an RYI student a couple of years ago who wrote a master's thesis about this section on the kings. So at some point that will become a useful resource for me. So as I, do this further research to sort of clarify the text years and years down the road, I am drawing on the collective knowledge of the entire field. And I'm sort of banking on the fact that wherever we are now, 10 or 15 years from now, we will have made great advancements. And a lot of the gaps in our understanding will have been filled in and so on, allowing me to sort of produce a more definitive translation that is ultimately mine, but draws on the entirety of our field of work. So that's a project I'm working on, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about the translation process.
I understand why you have this Wiley text as a reference, and so you can search all these things. But you can also search with Uchen. So why would you go through the trouble of transforming everything into Wiley?
It's just easier because that way I don't have to switch keyboards.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay.
I don't want to switch keyboard. That's adding a step, right?
I see.
I never even thought about searching in Uchan. I just, Wiley is just so easy to me because I've been working with it for so long that I look at it and it just reads like Tibetan to me. It doesn't even slow me down. So.
No, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. To take your specific example, you typed in the passage that you had trouble with, and it was how did you find out that Capstein had translated that? Google came up with that?
Yeah, because I guess in the footnote to his passage from some edited volume, some article in an edited volume, he had put in all the Wiley.
Oh, that's good. Oh.
And this is a funny conflict that we have because I think it's silly for people to put the entirety of the Wiley for every passage in there. I don't put the Wiley for everything in my book. You can go look it up. I'll give you the exact version of the text from the BDRC with the page and line number. You can go look it up, but I'm not going to type in the Wiley for it. I think that's sort of unnecessary bloat in our footnotes, but it's actually incredibly useful for stuff like this. So there's certainly a place for it. And there's an argument to be made. It facilitates Googling and people finding the exact passage.
Thank you.
When you translate the Tekpa Chimbo, I think because mine is the word of Sanskrit, and what you translate in English.
I said great vehicle. Right.
Great.
The great vehicle.
Vehicle. Okay.
That was just an example.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I'm really happy that you are translating the Chojung Kebegadun. This is one of the most great Chojung in Tibetan Buddhism. And did you complete this or still is going on?
I am 1/3 of the way finished my initial translation.
Okay.
So maybe 2.5 more years, I'll reach the end and have a complete version.
Yeah.
And then it will be 10 more years of cleaning it up and further research and so on. I don't know. I don't know how long it will take me.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good. I'm happy that you're translating one of the most great Chojung in Tibetan Buddhism.
And it's mostly useful for people interested in the Kagyu, right?
Yeah.
It's very much focused on the Kagyu, more so than the Blue Annals is.
It's also Kagyu, but it's a really good Chojung. It was pressed by the Kindin Chambel. I think you know Kindin Chambel. He have pressed this Chojung. He shows this Chojung. Actually, there's so many Chojung in Tibetan Buddhism, but you are trying to translate this and wish you best of luck.
So I started with the lives of the Siddhas. I was like, I know Kagyu history better than anything. That will be the easiest to me. So I started with the lives of the Siddhas, and like these are familiar to me. And that took me into the early history of the Kagyu, Milarepa Marpa, easy. Then the lives of the Karmapas. I'm sort of reaching the end of that now. The thing that I think will probably be the most challenging is the section on Tibet's kings. That's new to me. I imagine it'll be very different vocabulary, very different sort of stuff that's being talked about, such a different sort of context from what comes later. But I'm hoping by that point, having worked with this text for 2.5 years by that point, I'll be sort of attuned enough to how Pawo Tsuklak Trengwa expresses himself that I'll at least have a chance. I really don't know what it'll be until I get there. I'm concerned. We'll see how it goes, but we'll see. Great.
Hello, hi David. Just to follow up the previous question about the Wiley or getting around Wiley in some ways, like I talked to you a few weeks ago. For me, it's like I much more appreciate new books that have like the translation and the Tibetan in the. And what do you think about this kind of publications that more and more have both without any Wiley at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about the coming up against the publishing industry, right? And the sort of economics of publishing and how that's changing, right? It's constantly in flux. We have a lot of publishers that are struggling, and the books they're putting out are sort of cheaper and cheaper, and yet we're paying more and more for them. So there's sort of economic pressures on publishing and so on. If you can get a subvention and sort of put some money into the publishing process, maybe they'll allow you more flexibility and so on. So that's all very much in flux. Whether it's the Uchen, whether it's putting the Wiley towards the back. I mean, there's all different ways of doing it. That's not an option for this. For this, I plan not to have footnotes. My hope is to have just like a clean translation. And if someone wants to look something up, they'll have the page number and they can go back and see exactly what term it is. I want to produce something as clean as possible. But for shorter things, especially if it's practice text that people really want to sort of interact with in a different way, I think having the Tibetan or the Wiley is certainly very positive. But yeah. But again, it's sort of up to what the publisher will allow you. I mean, I might have to have footnotes, but I'm hoping not to. In my mind, I want it to be as clean as possible. I want someone to read the text.
Yeah. When you were
back and forth,
when you were first describing your process of collecting all the different instances, it seems to lend itself then towards at least a glossary of terms, right. If not perhaps some sort of. You were also talking about consulting outside databases, translations, et cetera. It then kind of lends itself even to maybe harmonization of the way you translate certain words.
Yeah. Yeah, a sort of controlled vocabulary. Not that I'm slavishly, it has to be this in every instance, but it is good for it to have sort of regularity to it, so that better conveys the sort of patterns within the author's own sort of writing style. But yeah, I mean, whether or not I'll have a list of sort of terms and how I translate them at the end, it's possible. But again, this will come up against the question of what the press will eventually allow me to do. I have no idea. That's a decision for 10 years from now.
I have a question not related to translation, but about the content. I've been doing research about Nartang Monastery.
Okay.
And there is some mention in the lineage of Nartang. They're calling it Nartang Kagyu, because it goes from Tilopa, Naropa, and then into the Kadampa lineage holders of Nartang. Is there any mention of that in this book?
Let's look afterwards. I will do a search. We will look in the entire. I don't know off the top of my head. This is part of it, right? When you're translating like this, you're not trying to like absorb. You're just sort of focusing on what's in front of you in the page. And I sort of forget things from 3 days prior, and that's okay. It's fresh every day. But we can look. We can sit down together and see if there's any reference to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
When we speak about translation, well, you're speaking about your translation process, right? I think a lot of it may be not accessible for beginners like me. So first of all, can you speak a little bit to what is the prerequisite to be able to translate the way you do? Like, I don't know, maybe you can speak to your education or how long you studied Tibetan, how well you're at it, etc. And then can you, do you have any advice for people who are just beginning, who are just 1 year or 2 years into the study of Tibetan at all?
So as I sit down each day and translate, right, I'm drawing from the entirety of my experience with Tibetan literature over the last 20 plus years, including, all the texts that I worked very closely with for my Mountain Dharma project, all the texts I work with earlier from my earlier research on the Nyumba, my translation of the life of the Madman of U, and so on, right? All of that is decades of experience that I have sort of inside of me. And when I look at a text and try and parse it, all of that is there. How do you get there? Through decades and decades of work with Tibetan literature. It doesn't get easier. And this is the thing, right? All this wealth of experience I have and so on, every single day I come across something, I say, I have no idea what this says. Every single day. I have trust and faith that I will figure it out as well as someone can. And that's the thing. For literature like this, in most cases, no one really knows. I learned this when I was translating the life of the Madman of U during 9 months of field work in India when I was working on my dissertation. I had certain sort of learned Tibetans I was working with at the library and different places. And I would ask someone, what does this mean? I would get an answer. And I ask someone else and get a different answer. And they're all informed opinions, but no one knows definitively because no one's reading this literature in many cases. Some of the stuff is sort of forgotten about and so on. So I have to sort of trust in my process and trust that I'm putting in as much time and thought and energy as a person could. Based on all my experience and so on. How you get there, it's just lots and lots of work. I studied Tibetan formally in graduate school at the University of Virginia. I studied at Tibet University for a year. It was sort of very formal, which worked for me. Having exams, having a midterm and a final and so on, and being forced to memorize verb tenses and stuff like that you might not have to do if you're just sort of reading on your own. I found that sort of stuff useful to me. So I guess the only answer is just stick with it, read widely, don't get frustrated. You're going to get frustrated, but just keep going and just sort of, if you're committed to it, right? And if it's a lifetime practice, which this is for me, you just stick with it. That's probably the worst answer you could expect. Just give it a couple decades. That's all. And it'll still be hard. Yeah.